want to express my appreciation for being able to be here with my colleague. Very proud of him this morning. See, he has the class well trained, and when he postpones an examination, there's not quite an uproar or demonstration. That's always a good sign of pedagogy. All right, and he gave you the reason for it. I'd like this morning to complete the matter of the canon by discussing the matter of the apocrypha. That's where we were last time. And then go on to give some indication, broad indication, of what puts men and women who approach the Old Testament in two distinct camps. What is it behind their thinking? What is it behind their approach? What are their presuppositions that put them in two diametrically opposite schools of thought? And then a word about how all of this came down so that we can be sure that the Old Testament we have now is, for all practical intents and purposes, what was given originally, what was used by our Lord Jesus and the apostles, by the church fathers of the first 7 centuries of the Christian era, and subsequent to that time. All right, the apocrypha. We mentioned that apocrypha comes from 2 Greek words meaning hidden, hidden away. We have this part of it in cryptogram, cryptograph, cryptic, and so on, apocrypha. It is a plural, as any Greek word is, that ends in an A. If it's singular, was O-N, phenomenon, phenomenon. Apocryphon is a singular. Apocrypha means these books that are outside of the canon. Now, there are a number of them that the Roman Church holds to, and as I said last time, they're not alone in that. There are folk in the Anglican or the Episcopal tradition who have a very high regard for these as well. Now, there are 3 specific arguments that have been given over the years in favor of the Apocrypha. That which has been considered as the strongest argument is that the Apocrypha were included in the early versions. Now, there are 4 early versions. About the 3rd century BC, we have the Septuagint. That's Greek translation of the Old Testament. And then, in the early part of the Christian era, we have the Targums. There's no one single Targum on all of the Old Testament. We have a number of them. We have one on the Pentateuch called Onkelos, and then we have a number on the historical books called the Targum of Jonathan, the son of Raziel, and so on. Those are matters that are not going to detain us. Then there is the Peshitta, meaning just like what vulgar translation would mean, not in the sense of obscene or base, but vulgar in the sense of the common people. This was in Syriac, which it has often been called Christian Aramaic. That also comes about the 2nd century BC, or 2nd or 3rd century BC. And then the Latin Vulgate, end of the 3rd century into the early part, 405 AD. I should put the Vulgate here. By Jerome. He was set to the task by the Bishop of Rome, Damasus, and this is in Latin. This preserves the Greek tradition down in Alexandria, Egypt. This in the Holy Land among the Aramaic-speaking Jews. This of the Christian church up around Syria, Odessa, Syria. Not Edessa, rather Edessa, not Odessa. Odessa is in Russia. This is Edessa. That's this tradition here of the Christian church. And Latin, that's the Western church. Their tradition of the Old Testament, Vulgate. Now, this is on the Old Testament alone. This is on the Old Testament alone because the Jews didn't receive the New Testament. And of course, this is on the Old Testament alone, because the New Testament is already in Greek. No point in translating it into Greek. Now the Peshitta is O and N, Old and New Testament. And the Vulgate is Old and New Testament. Now, it is found here. That is this collection. These books are found here. They're not found here. Now we're dealing with this argument about these apocryphal books being found in the versions. And they are the first translations. They couldn't translate them if they weren't there. Now the Peshitta does not have, Syriac Peshitta does not have the apocrypha. The Vulgate does have them, but with the express statement of Jerome that he did it against his own wishes, but according to pressure put on. Yes, sir.
Did I understand you to say that the Peshitta was in the 2nd and 3rd century BC?
No, AD.
AD.
Yes, these are all AD. Yes, sir. No, these are all AD. If I said BC, that was a slip. This is BC. This is the only one that's BC, about 285 and 280 to about 150 BC. AD, and way AD. Yes, these are all what we call immediate versions, means they were made directly from the original. Other versions, like our English version, made immediately through another source. So the argument goes, folks, that they were included in the early versions of the scriptures. The Syriac Peshitta didn't include them. The Targums did not include them. And the Vulgate, Jerome had stated he did not consider them canonical, inferior in value, but there was the pressure of the church. Now you say, well, why do they pay any attention to that? Well, if you've never been in this translation business, you don't know the pressures that are put on you. I remember when we were working with the Lockman Foundation, Dr. Sosa was on that committee, you'd have all kinds of letters and all kinds of pressure. Now, why shouldn't it be done that? I remember even when we were revising the Schofield Notes, it cost the Oxford University Press $1 million to revise the Schofield Bible. It came out in 1967, but you should have seen the letters we got. We had folk that were just literally blasting us from Dan to Beersheba. Why do you think that you're such knowledgeable folk? Are you popes? How would you ever dare to change any note in the Dr. Schofield? Well, we said, you're trying to make him a pope then. He would have been the last one to say that anything he did was final, because even in his own lifetime, there was another edition. The first edition was 1909 and the second one 1917. And one man in Chicago area said, you men must stop, cease, and desist until you let me come and take at least an hour, which would have been about 5 hours, knowing the man, and let me show you that we folk who believe in this particular view are the lineal descendants of the Schofield. So when you start doing something like that and let some folk know it, you better be sure that your typewriter has a new clean ribbon in it, because you're going to have to use it. So Jerome, after all, he was delegated, commissioned to do this by the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome now known as the Pope. They hadn't gotten quite that far. Not until Innocent III's time did they get so strong. They weren't that strong in the 4th century AD as they were in the 7th century AD. But Jerome didn't consider it canonical, but he was persuaded, over-persuaded, to incorporate the Apocrypha in his translation. Now the question remains, if it's not here, and it's under pressure here, how in the world does it get into what we might say is the pivotal translation, the earliest one? Well, they were, no question about it, in circulation with the canonical books. And it cannot be meant that there was a different and a wider canon. We cannot take it, there was a wider canon down in Egypt than there was in Palestine. As we said before, all historical evidence shows a clean and closely knit harmony between the Jews of Palestine and Alexandria. And they never take the Bible as a secondary issue. If men differ on matters like that, they are matters of tremendous import. There wouldn't have been anywhere near the harmony. We would have heard something about the disharmony and the discord and the ruckus that was caused between these groups. It couldn't have been the case if there would have been some kind of a note, even when they differed on a way minor point. They go all over the page in Talmudic discussion, telling about the fine points, the sophistry. It's called, their sophisticated reasoning is called pilpul, which is a word that shows salt and peppering, this involved, complex reasoning. Well, they do that about minor points. And don't forget, they did it in the medieval church too. They had long, learned, quote-unquote, discussions on how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. Now, Philo was an Alexandrian Jewish philosopher, and he quotes from all the canonical books. He mentioned it in passing last week, but he never quotes from any of the apocrypha, and the same of Josephus. How does this happen? When men who do not quote the Bible sort of casually, haphazardly, but knowingly, and with pertinence, relevance, with force, concisely, how is it that they never managed to quote? And they were writers of ability, and they were writers who wrote much. They were quite prolific. Well, another argument is, so that, you see, friends, takes a lot of the argument, the force out of this argument. One of the gentlemen who has studied the matter closely, C.H. Ryle, now this isn't Bishop Ryle, C.R.H.E. rather, H.E. Ryle, R-Y-L-E, has said, the reason these came into the Greek version was because after the Greek version was taken over by the Christians and the knowledge of Hebrew had declined, no longer knowing the limits of the Hebrew canon, they allowed some of these to come in. Now, another argument is they were read in the churches in public worship. That does not imply canonicity. I've heard good fundamental men in pulpits read from a current number of look or life or time. They'd be the last ones in the world ever to imply canonicity. Jerome himself says, and here's our statement, that he didn't take these to be authoritative. As therefore the church reads the books of Judith, Tobit, and Maccabees, but doesn't receive them among the canonical scriptures, so it also reads Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus for the edification of the people, but not for authority, to prove the doctrines of religion. And in the 4th century A.D., there was the Orthodox party at the Nicene Council when they were trying to ferret out the scriptural doctrine of the person of Christ, whether he was the created or the uncreated Son of God. And the Orthodox party won out. The head of it was Athanasius. The head of the heterodox party was Arius. It's called the Arian controversy. Athanasius expressed himself exactly as Jerome did. Now, in the Church of England, even in modern times, they read certain lessons from the apocrypha. But you ask even a high churchman, he's a man who has the high liturgical view, high concept of the Church of England, even apostolic succession, going back to apostolic times and the like. You ask him, do you, when you read that, believe that it's on the same basis as Romans, or Isaiah, or Genesis, or Acts? Say, no, we're just reading it for edification. Then the third argument, and with this we close this portion, they argue, those who want the Apocrypha in the Old Testament, and the same holds for the New, they were quoted by the fathers, the church fathers, as divinely authoritative. Now Rosemead, the city of Rosemead, just like all the cities in Southern California or throughout the state or nation, have what we call city fathers. That means leaders. When you talk about city fathers, you mean city leaders. And we talk about church fathers, we mean leaders in the church in the first 7 centuries A.D. Now this argument runs this way, that these books were quoted by these church fathers as divinely authoritative. Therefore, they belong in the canon. Well, we refute this on 3 grounds. First of all, a quotation is not tantamount to canonization. You have to see how it's quoted. Is it quoted as merely an illustrative comment? Is it quoted as fortifying doctrine? And we do know this, that many of the church fathers were careless in their quotations, just like the writers of the Talmud. Well, you say, how would you know? Well, if you read through your New Testament, even in English, you'll see every so often it says, as it is written. In the Greek, hos gegroptai, as it has been written. In the Old Testament, it's kakothuv, as it has been written. And you can go through the Talmud and find that, and most of the times, unless they're slipping over, and it's a minimal amount, they are referring, and you can go right back to the Old Testament and find the reference. In other words, there is a precise way of quoting the Old Testament, both on the part of the church fathers and the Talmud. But some men get careless, and they use the same formula in quoting the scriptures and the apocrypha. They just say, as it is written. If they just say, as the apocrypha state, or as it is written in an apocryphal book, they don't take the time to say that. They use the same formula, which causes confusion. Now, are you sure about that? We're so certain of it because we'll take the same church father, and you'll see he's careless in the matter, because elsewhere he's declared himself against the apocrypha, and yet when he comes to quote the book, what does he do? He quotes it with the formula that you must use only and exclusively and entirely for biblical books. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if we were to put aside all these three arguments we've mentioned and say, well, they're not as strong as, there may be an element where the apocrypha ought to be given more validity and more basis. Well, if that be so, friends, then the apocrypha, if they're going to be ruled out, can be ruled out by internal evidence alone. I like it to stand on this basis, apart from anything else. Let the books speak for themselves. And on the basis of internal evidence, these books cannot be considered authoritative or canonical. Why? They abound, and I mean the word abound, in geographical, historical, chronological errors that are often ludicrous. And you cannot prove that in any canonical book. They promote superstition. They sanction deception. They make salvation, this is the most serious thing of all, they make salvation, pardon of sin, that is, depend on deeds of merit, even when the deeds are of just an external, formal nature. Don't even have to put any heart in it. If you just go through the rounds, you just count your beads. And then they teach, these apocryphal books do, these doctrines are not in all of them, but in the aggregate, you find all these doctrines. There are 7 holy angels that have the mediatorial work of Christ in prayer. They're represented as performing that mediatorial work of Christ in prayer. Well, that robs Christ of his glory. Either they're right or the Bible's wrong. Some of the books base morality on expediency. Sounds a little like situation ethics. They base morality on expediency, and where should it be based? Only on one place, the holy character of God. They teach the doctrine of emanations, which is part and parcel of Gnosticism, that God can't have contact, so there's an intervening bunch of, if I can't have contact with you, then I'll hold the hand of a second person who holds the hand of a third, holds the hand of a fourth and fifth. Emanations, E-M-A-N-A-T-I-O-N-S. For instance, Ecclesiasticus justifies cruelty to slaves. some of the Greek philosophers didn't think much of slaves. One of them apologized for weeping over the death of his servant, one of the Greek philosophers. It's supposed to be a sign of weakness in him. Cruelty to slaves justifiable. Hatred of Samaritans, that's all right. The first book of Maccabees, which has a good bit of historical material, fine historical material, but first Maccabees justifies suicide. Any kind of side is against the Word of God. We're not allowed to murder, even ourselves. Did you notice in the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, the verb has no object? You're to keep the Sabbath holy. There's an object there. You're to honor your father and mother. There's an object there. You're not to covet, and a number of compound objects in the 10th commandment. But that commandment on kill has no direct object. Thou shalt not murder. That means yourself or anybody else. Suicide is not biblical. It's first Maccabees justifies suicide, therefore it's unbiblical. It also justifies prayers and offerings for the dead. That's why in the Jewish synagogue, as well as in the Roman church, they do pray for the dead. That is not biblical. That is not what Scripture commands. Now, so much then for this matter of canon. It's a matter that will properly and rewardingly repay a great deal of attention and study. Now, this morning, I want to deal with a gentleman whose name is connected with this line of cleavage that we're talking about. What is it that puts some men in this camp here and this camp right over here? What is their approach? You have somebody come in counseling with you, and you say, do I understand you're a minister? Yes. And what church are you a minister of? He tells you what church. And he feels he ought to tell you that he is a minister of a church that is a very modern and liberal church. Now, you want to know what he means by that. What is it that makes his church modern and liberal over against another church that considers itself more historical and more traditional, more on the basics or on the fundamentals of the faith? Well, it goes back to a work that was done by a very great scholar, Julius Wellhausen. Pronounced that W as V because he was a German, and they pronounced W's as V. That's why a German coming over here will say, "What do you want?" Because you pronounce W's as V, and I suppose they have as much right to do it, they're doing it anyhow, as the Latins had to pronounce V as W. The word for man, V-I-R, is not vir, but wir in Latin, as you well know. Now, Julius Wellhausen lived from 1844 to 1918, quite a long while. You'll hear people talking about Wellhausenism and the Wellhausen school and the Wellhausenists. He was a learned man. He was a professor at Greifswald, Halle, Marburg, and Göttingen. He was an Old Testament first and then carried over this can of worms into the New Testament. And before his life was out, he had gone out of the theological faculty altogether, and the reward is that he had no basis of faith left at all, and I can see why. This man was a prolific writer. He was a consistent writer. He exerted a considerable influence in Old Testament circles. In fact, our Old Testament reduction we're using now has about 1,250 pages, and in every single book of the Old Testament, mark it, every single book of the Old Testament that's discussed, all 39 books, this author has to take time out, as we do, to give all the various opinions on the historicity, the authenticity, the verity, the purpose and all of this book. And invariably, that's the word, invariably, almost monotonously, they have to take into account what Wellhausenists are saying. But you say that view is dead. Oh no, it's only been modified. But the basic presuppositions are still there. See? It's just like treating symptoms, and you still have that virus there that one of the days, lying latent, just like in dysentery, if it lies amoebic type, it lies waiting, it can blossom and bloom anytime. As many folk as have thought this thing was dead, why archaeology has killed it. Now, it was my privilege to study at Hopkins with a man who knows. He's been one of the greatest forces to show the invalid arguments in Wellhausen. And yet when it comes to laying out some of those documents, he doesn't want the basic presuppositions that go, but when he lays out the documents, for instance, of the Pentateuch or the rest of the historical books and all, he somehow, it is a most inconsistent thing. He follows through on the Wellhausen system. You say, well, how can men be like that? Well, sometimes, if they see their inconsistencies, it can cause a great deal of emotional disturbance. But some of them are amazing. I sometimes tell my students about Professor Nathan Isaacs, an Orthodox Jew who taught in the law school at Harvard. Students would come to him, they'd say, Professor Isaacs, do you believe the first 2 chapters of Genesis as to creation? He says, I believe it implicitly. Aren't you a learned man? Don't you believe in the Darwinian approach? He says, I believe that implicitly. Well, they said, how in the world can you do that, Professor? He says, I hold one position in one compartment of my mind, and I hold the other position in another compartment of my mind. And I said to the students, heaven help him if he ever shakes his head. And some of it spills over from one compartment to another. But men can do that. They live in glorious inconsistency. Now, of course, all of us have a certain amount of inconsistency between what we believe and what we do. But if you have so many inner contradictions and paradoxes in what you believe, oh, brother, how are you going to live with yourself? So I tell the students, you can't ride 2 horses, even in a circus. You can't ride 2 horses at the same time unless they're going in the same direction. You can only ride them together if they're going the same direction. If they go the opposite one, you're bad off. You're going to have to get some landing place. All right, now what was the background? Now, Wellhausen, like everybody else in the world, was a man of his times. The times make the man, and then the man makes the times. What were the influences that were pressing in on Wellhausen? And you have to, if you approach this in the Old Testament from this angle, these 3 angles, you will see what triggered Wellhausen and what triggers men who study and teach the New Testament as well. First of all, though he was a remarkable, well, let's give him his due, brilliant thinker, he was tremendously touched by the currents of his day. What was the first? The anthropocentric view of the world. The anthropocentric view of the world. Meaning what? Well, the rationalism of the 18th and 19th centuries, everything has got to be according to our reasoning, and anything that isn't has to be thrown out. And that was an aftermath, too, of the Renaissance, humanism. See, the rationalism of the 18th and 19th century built on the previous humanism, coming out of the Renaissance and so on. This rationalism, friends, made man the center of all the universe. Man is self-determining, man is self-sufficient. This causes plenty of neuroses. A fellow tries to carry this thing through categorically and unwaveringly. Man is self-determining and self-sufficient. I remember when I went to the university, the Watsonian school was real strong. These psychologists were very, very strong, and a poem that was read often in the churches, memorized, I am the captain of my fate, I am the master of my soul. That was the whole position. That being so, they said, let man express himself. Well, when the unregenerate man expresses himself, it's like a cesspool. It's been opened with the lid off. But here man's self-determining, self-sufficient. And even God is only a means. used by man. My younger son has written his graduate thesis for his Master of Divinity on the literary and philosophical implications of the prose portions of Job. And believe it or not, Carl Jung has taken time out to approach the book of Job from a psychological viewpoint. And he's found things there that I'm sure would amaze Job. You know what he claims? One of his postulates is that the book, the thrust, the impetus of the book is to show that God needs man. See? God needs Job, not just to gain a point with Satan in the first 2 chapters, but to prove, makes God a very deficient, dependent person, you see. And all this still, don't you see, is this underlying basic philosophical approach that man is dominant, man is at the top, he's at the apex. Well, he is at the apex of creation, but he's not at an apex where God is down at the pyramidal section. Very difficult to maintain a balance, an equilibrium in thought. And you make man with all his waverings and his fluctuations and his infirmities and his inabilities and his inequities and his shortcomings. When you make him the top, but that's the view. Julius Wellhausen inherited this. Man is self-determining, he's self-sufficient. Even God can be brought in as a means to be used by man. Man is not created in the image of God, God is created in the image of man. And we're going to talk about the second point, and I might just jump ahead a moment, the theory of evolution. That places man on the pinnacle as the highest creature. What does this mean? God then is dethroned. He's no longer sovereign. And if you don't think that's in the forefront today, Bishop Robinson thoroughly read his work on Honest to God. He talks about the finiteness of God and the deity of man. He actually speaks of that in just that way. God is no longer sovereign, and by so much he's no longer noble. We'll mention Kant a bit later. Theology then must be restricted when it talks about knowing God. Well, what about this? This created a tremendous tension. Why? Because even a superficial reading, certainly an unbiased reading of the Old Testament, gives you an altogether different picture. In the beginning, God created us something majestic, something not even argued. God says, it happens. The Old Testament is far from anthropocentric. It is theocentric. The Old Testament is the account of the sovereign movings of God among men. It's in providence, in nature, in history. He's a miracle-working God. That means that he can, for purposes known to him, set aside the orderly course of nature for a high purpose. That must be a God who is omnipotent. It must be a God who's omniscient. It must be a God who is benevolent. Not only benevolent, but beneficent. Not only willing good, but doing good. That was the first point, anthropocentric. And my dear friends, you'll find it in more places than another. And I just want to tell you, not so much from a psychological viewpoint, but from a theological viewpoint, you'll never get a man who's well balanced, whose presuppositions are anthropocentric. Now, he's not going to be well balanced. He's not going to view the scripture correctly. He's not going to have the right outlook on his own life. And that's what causes this tension. Then secondly, the evolutionary concept. He was touched by that. There were fertile grounds for his view. His age was bent on introducing the evolutionary concept. Now, whatever may be its failings, the failings of the evolutionary concept, in biology, in the realm of science, it, believe me, it has worked havoc in the area of philosophy, theology, and sociology. An unproved theory that has done no end of devastation. I'm happy to say that we're living in a state that has now on this law books that you may teach the creation view as a live option. And I happen to know, just heard it last week during a taping session for a radio broadcast, that the father of one of my friends is working with a group of men on such a textbook. A number of scientists with reputable degrees, valid degrees from valid institutions, are working on such a one in commission. The sooner it gets out, the better. It would have been wonderful if we would have had it already. It's in process. But this evolutionary concept, not only in nature, they bring it into the sphere of history. Now, what are the effects of the application of evolutionary principles to history and theology? Well, at least these two, folks. Number one, man becomes more and more accustomed to thinking of long periods of development in man's history. The less developed is the earlier in point of time. The more developed, the later. And any linguist or philologist that's worth his salt knows that that couldn't be any more wrong. Our linguist Wycliffe and others have gone into pagan tribes, unlearned tribes, and have mastered their languages and found that their languages are so much more complex and developed than even the inflected languages that we know in the modern world. This doesn't hold up at all. The less developed is the earlier, the more developed the later. This is part and parcel too, that man's getting better. And what was the ultimate? Well, ultimately we shall be as Hegel, not needing the crutch of religion at all. Man is accustomed then to long periods of development in the history of man. Secondly, there's an inclination to view man, as I've just indicated it, as capable of endless growth. Man can grow and develop and mature. There's no end to his maturation. Even religion is only a transitory stage. And so somebody who's imbued with this and hears people talking about God and trusting the Lord and this, that, and the other, he smiles just as he overhears conversation around the middle of December, very heated and very animated and very earnest conversation among little folk about just exactly the whereabouts of Santa Claus and his activities in the next 10 days after the middle of December. They just smile knowingly, well, you'll get out of it. You grow out. Just as a child, I thought as a child, spoke as a child, how do you expect a child to do? Exactly. Now your child will come to you and say, why is water wet? You may not know, but you don't ask the question. You don't ask the question. Why is an orange that shape and that color? You may not know, but you know better than to ask. See? So you may just smile. You're advanced beyond that. This religion business, from the evolutionary viewpoint, is just a step until you can throw it all off and walk on your own 2 feet, like Hegel. Hegel was this philosopher who built it all on the basis, whole theology on the basis, his whole philosophy on the basis of the evolutionary principle. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Found it everywhere. Pauline party, Petrine party, and then the synthesis that finally came out of New Testament viewpoint. The viewpoint of the fellow who's interpreting it at the moment. The Old Testament, the prophetic party, the priestly party, and then the survival of the fittest. Well, there was a conflict here too, in this second point. A conflict here just as with the first point, between the Wellhausen system and the Old Testament. What does the Old Testament show? Well, from the very beginning, God is creator. Man is made adaptable to his environment. From all I can read in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, especially the second chapter, Adam didn't lack a thing. He wasn't worried about social security. He wasn't worried about infringing on other men's rights. He wasn't afraid about committing antisocial, asocial, immoral acts. No, not at all. He was adapted to his environment. He wasn't called upon to attain anything, any position. He was called upon to maintain the goodness he already possessed. And then Genesis 3 tells us the tragic fact of the fall. How all of God's creation was thrown out of harmony with himself. And if ever an account verified itself and substantiated itself, that third chapter of Genesis, I have seen it in my more than a half a century of life. I've seen it multiplied I don't know how many times. You take a world always dealing with symptoms. Let's get rid of war, they say, the war in Vietnam. And then what's that going to mean with a war in Europe, war in the Near East? What's going to mean with a war in Latin America, you see? You're just dealing with symptoms, not causes. But ever since the fall of man, he's been bent that way. How do you know? When God said, what are you hiding for, Adam? You know you and I have a rendezvous. A daily rendezvous. Why are you hiding? Have you eaten of the tree which I command you not to eat of it? And what was Adam's very learned, what was his PhD answer? What was it? I was naked. Do you notice what he left out? He didn't say I was sinned. Oh no. He's going to blame it on Eve before it's all over with. But he says, I was naked and hid myself. You see. That in itself shows that something's happened to his intellect. God wasn't asking him for information. He was just putting the searchlight out to point on it, to point up the gravity of what he had done and the seriousness of his fall. So Genesis 3 tells of the tragic fall and how all God's creation is thrown out of harmony with himself. I really feel sorry for even a physician. Certainly any sociologist, anyone who deals with human beings, who cannot see that the whole universe is abnormalistic. That's the only normal view to take of history round about us, of mankind. It's the only way to explain men, is that they're acting abnormally. Shakespeare was only partly right when he said there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. There's something rotten in every state and all over the world. So the Old Testament always presents man, here's my point, as going from the higher to the lower, and not the reverse. Who ever heard of a sickness curing itself? Who ever heard of a falling object retrieving itself? It's an actual, proven fact. It's a proved fact of science that the farther an object falls, the faster it falls. The farther it falls, the faster it falls. Now the third, and with this we're going to close this portion, and then we'll take it up after our break. There was another point at which Wellhausen and the Old Testament picture were at variance, came into conflict. Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, Critique of Pure Reason, probably what he's best known for. He lived 1724 to 1804. Kant and other philosophers, in treating religion, looked at religion as subjective, as purely subjective, that is to say, a state of feeling, divorced, as it were, from all objective considerations. How does that work out practically? Well, here is an individual dying on a middle cross, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, if you feel that he's dying for you, well and good. If I don't, that's none of your business. It's just a matter of, if it has that value, it's what's called value judgment in the Richelieu school. If it has that value for you, all right, but don't think that it has to have that value for everybody else. I heard some men speaking along this line over at Occidental. Dr. Ram was over there with a number of the men. And one of them, he said, I'd be ashamed of myself. He says, if I'd ever told a Muslim that he ought to become a Christian, he said, I'd feel I was sinning. Think of that. He'd think he was sinning. In the same breath, the law of Moses is no more valid than anything else. Well, what is your touchstone for sin then? What are you deviating from, you see? Everything's on the same basis. If I have no right to tell that man that if he's worshiping an idol, that's wrong. If it makes him feel good, all right. After all, Schultz was probably right when he puts one of these kids in bed with his blanket. Makes him feel good. Everybody's got to have some kind of a blanket. Sometimes the religion is. It's a state of feeling. It has no objective value. And religion isn't God coming into human society seeking sinning man. It's a story of man's rather bungling effort to reach up and commune with God or the immaterial world. And you have no right to laugh at anyone any more than a college student has a right to laugh at a high school student or a grammar school student, because given a certain number of years, they'll be right where he is, or in graduate school. Give him time. They feel that way? Nothing wrong. All religion is on the same level. All intrinsic, I should say, differences are eliminated. Now, the Old Testament has a diametrically opposite position. It says that God came into the human sphere choosing, loving, redeeming. In other words, the Bible being theocentric, God has done some objective things that have value no matter what your view of it is. Now, there are variations. A person may be colorblind and not see that that color is blue, or that this is a black notebook, and so on. Maybe certain variations. But if you vary too much, how are we going to get anywhere? If all of us here say that the sun is shining out there and you say no, then on what basis can we continue any further discussion? You see, there has to be something of an objective nature that we all can agree on. There must be something that we know of as axiomatic, self-evident. So it wasn't Israel who chose God, he chose them. Not man reaching up, but God reaching down. God did something. Not just, well, for instance, what makes you want to reach up to begin with? Kant never explained that. Why do you have to have some kind of subjective feeling? If you're such an end in yourself, what do you need it all together? So there's no method of approach to God, worship of God. God does that himself. Man can't reach out and do that. He makes a mistake every time. The first chapter of Romans shows us that, for instance. And we see that. Missionaries see it throughout the world. Let's take about a 10-minute break, folk, and then we'll begin at this point showing what some of the very serious weaknesses in 3 special fields are, and then come to the final bringing of all this down to our present text of Scripture.